From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are you. You are here. That makes this the stuff they don't want you to know, coming to you live from a little thing called the United States. The history of our country, our modern version of this country, is, if anything, I think it's fair to say, a history of protest, right? It was started as a conspiracy by European colonists who protested and rebelled against monarchies. And the history of this country is largely a history of disenfranchised minorities protesting, even today, discrimination and other terrible things. And you know what got me about this? In general, in theory, it's so strange. If you read a textbook, after enough time has passed, these protests are often seen as righteous and noble, but only after they have occurred.
Super common for that to be the case. And the tragic irony here, I don't think is lost on any of us, the idea that, you know, the United States was formed as a result of protest in and of itself. But it's almost like only we are the righteous ones, and everyone else that we have to step on to get to our goals is totally fair game.
And any group that wants to protest the government in general has been in the past viewed as enemies of the state, right? Anyone who wants to change the current power structures, the way things function, these groups, at least elements within them, have been viewed as literal enemies.
Women voting? Terrorism, I say. It says,
well, I don't know about that.
Well,
I don't know if
that's what
they
they said,
infiltrated the suffrage. Did they infiltrate the suffrage movement?
There was no actual infiltration. It was just the vilification we're talking about. Heard. Yeah. And when we look at, I love the points we're raising here. When we look at the events themselves, the protests, the movements for equality themselves, and you look at the times and the context in which these movements transpire, we see over and over again a deep river of conspiracy. Tonight's episode, the United States versus the American Indian movement. Here are the facts. This is common knowledge, right? The U.S. did and does treat Native American or indigenous communities pretty terribly, right? I think we're all of the age where you could even learn this in your textbooks growing up, right?
I think for the most part, this didn't get a pass in traditional public schooling, or at least, you know, what I experienced. I mean, the Trail of Tears, the displacement of around 60,000 Native people belonging to the 5 civilized tribes between around 1830 to 1850, just a mass displacement, really, with zero attention or care paid to what would happen to them. And even today, I think we've talked about that. Finally, it feels like in literature and pop culture, the Native story is finally getting a little bit of air. Could
you tell everybody a little bit what is meant by 5 civilized tribes?
Yeah, that's just the term that's used to describe them. I think they were just organized. They had, culture, they had lands, they had leadership. And essentially the U.S. government just said, screw that. We don't care about your history. We don't care about your legacy. We don't care about your culture. We just want your land. I believe the tribes were the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw nations is what they're referred to, because these are long legacy peoples with, religions, with belief systems, with government, with, of course, family and ways of feeding and clothing and taking care of themselves that were unconnected to the larger, civilized world, let's call it.
Yeah. And to be clear, and this is an apolitical point, to be clear, separating those 5 cultures and communities and calling only them civilized out of the many, many tribal or indigenous communities in the U.S. was a move
Absolutely.
to divide people, to
Yes.
other them.
Yes, no, 100%. And I just to wrap up my point, I'm just saying, like, of in the last maybe 10 years, we have finally really seen some of these stories come into the fore. You know, with films like Killers of the Flower Moon and television series like Reservation Dogs. These were stories that I, was not familiar with, and it's really interesting to see, a view inside of reservation communities and how rough they have it. And like basically we just said, as a consolation prize for all the horrific acts we perpetrated on them, here you can have this little kind of also ran piece of land and certain fundings, but there are not thriving communities.
Yeah, we've hit on a lot of this on this show before, especially when we're talking about tribes that still exist in Alaska and parts of Canada and places where they are the human beings within these, tribal lands are neglected often and forgotten by power structures that exist around them, which, are meant to be separate from these areas and from like the governance and the policing. But at the same time, it's a weird situation of, I would say, in my opinion, a deliberate, I was going to say lack of resources, but it's like a pullback of resources.
Persecution by negligence.
There you go.
And for me to say these communities aren't thriving, that is not a ding on the communities. It is exactly a reference to what you're saying, a lack of resources, a lack of attention, by the government.
I would also say that that passive persecution via negligence transforms to a more active persecution if ever resources are discovered on the small bit of land that is left. Talking about the uranium story that hit the news recently.
Yep. Oh, the one last thing, just about that 5 tribes thing we're talking about and how othering that was on purpose. I think it's also a way to identify what would be considered an organized enemy, an enemy that can and in the eyes of the government or the people that are calling them that, can and should be fought, basically.
Right. To define and address, which is always the mission, and also similar to European activities on the African continent. You want to you want to do everything you can to diminish or erase communication, unity, and community, or common cause between tribes that, of course, had a very long history of collaboration and conflict far before even the Vikings came over, because people have been here for a long, long time. What we're all saying here, fellow conspiracy realists, is something we all know, hopefully. It is common knowledge that Europeans who arrived in the Americas did horrible, horrible things to the many varied cultures and communities that already long existed here. Pretty much every nasty thing you can think of with the technology at the time was deployed.
Biological warfare. Seriously. But yeah, it was the indigenous peoples of North America were the first enemies of any kind of organized government that landed from the outside in North America, right?
Those are literally just defending their lands and their people from invaders,
But it's crazy to think, when we're going in time, from the moment that the United States is formed, and I mean, well before that, when they're just colonies here, these groups and peoples are the enemies of the establishment.
Well, and the Indian Removal Act is what led to the Trail of Tears. Well, it wasn't exactly putting them in camps per se or lining them up and having them executed. It, by many accounts of historians and scholars, was an example of genocide or ethnic cleansing, just by virtue of the fact that many of them, thousands of them, did not make it to their destination because of disease, because of starvation.
At least partially by design. Yeah, you don't have to look far to learn the history. Massacres, disease, as you said, genocide, forced relocation, assimilation, which would be cultural erasure. And the overall theme is an unending line of broken promises and treaties, the consequences of which continue in the modern day. And folks, we're here with you. Many of our fellow conspiracy realists are first tribe, Native American, or indigenous, or you share ancestry from indigenous communities, like several of us on the show. So for many of us, this is familiar. There's a quote I found that gives us a snapshot of the present day that kind of sums up everything we said. It's from a bit of a problematic source with an agenda, but I think it's interesting to quote from this problematic source because even they recognize a problem. So I want to give this quote in like a professorial voice.
This is from the Foundation for Economic Education. And yes, one of the reasons the United States became the most prosperous nation in the history of the world can be found in the institutions created to protect individual liberty, free markets, and private property rights, all of which incentivize entrepreneurship and innovation. Unfortunately, the prosperity that exists due to the institutions created by the founders is not afforded to all American citizens.
We're going to stop it there because that's about as far as they get in terms of stuff we all agree with. After that, they get into how amazing deregulation will be. And that is just cartoonishly incorrect.
Well, in the name of entrepreneurship and innovation, we must end regulatorship.
Sure. Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's what the founding fathers, who had all kinds of proposed regulations, would surely have wanted. They were more occupied with stockings and wigs. The statistics are there for anybody who cares to look. For instance, some of the best numbers come from about 4 years ago. The Native American poverty rate in the United States was north of 25%, 26.2% in 2020, almost double that of the rest of the U.S. Forced relocation has also led to another consequence people don't often think about, which is the United States purposely pushed these people by hook or by crook into land that they thought was worthless. Hard, arid land, very difficult to survive, And as a result of that, in the modern evenings, these communities are much more vulnerable to climate change. And did someone think about that? Maybe. But did they care? Absolutely not. This is where we have to talk about termination policy, which was a real name, not from some sort of 1800s manifest destiny crap, but from 1953. Termination policy is a real thing the feds did.
Termination policy is when the government, as you said in 1953, decided by itself, hey, we'd no longer recognize a lot of tribes, like 100 or more tribes. And they made people in tribes that they no longer recognized leave the areas that they pushed them to in the first place, historically. It's just insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They said, well, we know that we did recognize you as we recognize your culture. We recognize you as a people with, and we know we have this whole thing earlier with inalienable rights, but you guys got to get out again. You got to go to like Chicago or Milwaukee or Minneapolis, just, GTFO.
Well, yeah. The weird thing that I don't understand with this is, did they make all of those people who were members of tribes once now American citizens? Like, is that what they did? They said, hey, guess what? You're a citizen now. Congratulations. I honestly don't know.
Well, what they did try to do through actual infrastructure, I guess, was assimilate them without really giving them the same rights afforded to, American citizens. And I guess this is as good a time as any just to mention a new story that just came out from the New York Times about these Indian boarding schools that from the 1800s to as late as the 1960s, the U.S. government actually removed Native children from their homes and families and sent them to these boarding schools where they were taught to be Americans, essentially cultural erasure. Spent about around $25 billion by today's measure on this effort. And there's a report that came out very recently. This article from the Times is from July 30th, that nearly 1,000 American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian children died while attending these Indian assimilation boarding schools.
And do check out our earlier episodes on these sorts of operations, these conspiracies. Sometimes north of the U.S. border in Canada, they were called residential schools. But though the names and the nomenclature may change, the goal of these terrible operations is the same. Many people under termination policy did move. In some cases because they could not afford not to move due to the carrots and sticks employed against them. And when they did move to these cities, they found there were no jobs, there were no educational opportunities, and they were heavily profiled and persecuted by local law enforcement of the time, like heavy. And as a result of this chaos, this continuing aggression, the American Indian Movement arises, or AIM, as it was typically called in some COINTELPRO documents. It's founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, one of those cities that people were pushed to under termination policy. And it's generally the brainchild of four people: Ojibwe activist George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, Eddie Benton Benai, and Clyde Bellacourt. Their original purpose is to provide aid to Native peoples, members of these communities that apparently don't exist, according to Congress. And they say, we're going to help these people who got forcibly displaced, again, in the modern day. And as they continued, they met with success. Their goals grew to encompass an entire spectrum, a panoply of Native demands that have been going on for generations now: economic independence, recognition of traditional culture, protection of legal rights, like, hey, maybe enforce one of these treaties at some point, and autonomy over tribal areas. The big one, the big sticky one for the feds, the restoration of lands that had, in Ames' perspective, been illegally seized. And also, by the way, in the perspective of pretty much any legal scholar, have been illegally seized.
But doesn't it just show how a lot of these treaties are kind of just optics, and, we're not fair dealing, with these tribes, with these groups, because we don't view them, or historically didn't view them, as equal, or there was almost a desire to like put one over on their leadership. I don't know. When I see things like this and these kinds of treaties that are just time and time again not honored, I just feel like things like this are toothless, and just sort of like to absolve the oppressor, of responsibility, rather than to actually do something positive for the oppressed.
Dude, okay, there's a connection here. I agree with you. The connection is the civil rights movement and Black Power movements. So let's go back to, because we said that the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis. Let's jump to Oakland, California, 1966. That's when Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, that has a lot of the same goals. And it was viewed immediately as a negative thing, a threat to the establishment, to the United States government. And I can only imagine that when the American Indian Movement forms, there are eyes on, like, at least from certain areas of the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area.
How diplomatic. Yes, certain areas of Virginia. AIM's leaders did, you're absolutely right, Matt. AIM's leaders took inspiration from the civil rights movement and the policies of nonviolent confrontation, nonviolent protest. As time went on, as we will see, this strategy evolved, perhaps out of necessity. AIM was involved in many, many protests, some of which we'll get to. The occupation of Alcatraz, which does have a little bit of levity to it. The Trail of Broken Treaties demonstration in 1972.
That's the big one, right?
That's one of the big ones, yeah. And the occupation of Wounded Knee or Reservation in 1973. This is all just the tip of a proverbial iceberg. Let's consider the context. As we were saying, the 1970s, like as we said at the top, this can sound strange in 2024, this bevy of conspiracies. We get it. But we have to understand that in the 1970s, the public is still reeling after the assassinations of folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy. The U.S. government is still intensely concerned. From their perspective, any civil rights movement might be a front for a foreign power, cough, cough, Soviet Russia, cough, cough, or a homegrown threat to the status quo. So what may seem to us to be a very American impulse to push for equality and more rights could, to the powers that be, seem a lot more like a domestic terrorist organization, even if they don't use those phrases.
You're saying that it was seen as potential for opportunists to co-opt the movement and kind of infiltrate it and use it, bend it to their own aims, or sort of be masquerading as members of this protest movement, but actually be attempting to, seek aims that are unrelated to that movement?
Well, keep in mind, that's an excellent question. No, let's keep in mind that the U.S. is acutely aware of the possibilities of these tactics because at this point they have deployed them in Latin America for decades.
Yeah, they have.
Exactly.
Well, and they're also at this time, right as all of this is occurring, the FBI has an active, quote, rabble-rouser index that they've been tracking for years of people, individuals within organizations that they think might be a threat. And the individual is a specific threat because they're either really good at talking to other people or they're really good at whatever it is they do within that organization.
Or they have a perceived web of connections.
Exactly.
And those connections may be the problematic piece. So our question tonight, this is a bit of a softball, how did agencies like the FBI and CIA react to AIM? How did the U.S. respond to these demands for equality, equity, and justice? We'll tell you after a word from our sponsors. Here's where it gets crazy. Uncle Sam eventually totally tried to crush AIM, similar to the techniques applied against the earlier civil rights movement. We're talking blackmail, we're talking trying to turn people, get some moles in there. Pretty much from the jump, they regarded AIM in a, if not antagonistic light, in a very skeptical, distrustful light. But their first responses seemed surprisingly reasonable, especially if you look from the perspective of 2024's incredibly hostile and divisive climate. The Nixon administration ran into something that is absolutely going to have to be a full ridiculous history episode. They helped occupy Alcatraz Island. You guys remember Alcatraz Island from like when Sean Connery got caught up in there?
Yeah. The Rock.
The Rock.
Yes. That's
all those green balls, man.
I loved it.
Look out.
I went on a tour of Alcatraz when I was really little, and it made an impression on me. I mean, it is a really interesting kind of, museum at this point. There is some interesting history to it, of course. But what it represented was the iron-fisted grasp of United States, hegemony, I guess, the ability to contain the bad elements, on this island. Mm-hmm. Inescapable, unless you're, of course, Sean Connery and Nick Cage with the green balls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, it starts being a prison in 1934, and it shuts down in 1963. When it shuts down in 63, Native American organizations start lobbying, and they say, hey, look, you're not using this. Can we redevelop this island as a Native American cultural center or school, or school? And in March of 64, just a year after the prison shuts down, 5 members of the Sioux community attempt to seize the island, to take physical possession of it under an interesting treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which technically, if the U.S. ever enforced it, would allow Native American communities to appropriate surplus federal land.
Wait a minute.
Oh,
What constitutes surplus, though, guys? I mean, we're planning an arcade. We're going to put a Dave and Buster's there. This is not surplus.
Well,
folks.
hey, that project that you're speaking of has not gone across the table yet. So they are unaware of any plans for a giant Dave and Buster's on Alcatraz. So theoretically, at this moment, it is surplus.
Right. And also, we know the game. Treaties in the U.S. work in one direction. Shout out to Iran. You know what I mean? Like, that has always been the great game. And
Shout out to One Direction. You know,
right.
Masters of diplomacy.
And New Direction. These early efforts do fail, but because of this, the island becomes a focal point, a symbol of government indifference toward the indigenous. And so reclaiming it amidst these communities is a powerful rallying cry. Let's get the rock. A fire destroys the American Indian Center in San Francisco in October in 1969, and a new activist group rises. Indians of all tribes. Dennis Banks and other members of AIM are part of this grand coalition. It's like a super group. It's like the Avengers of this activism. And at first, they send a handful of protesters to the island on November 9th in 1969. They're led by a college student from the Mohawk community, a guy named Richard Oakes. They last maybe around 24 hours. They're there around 24 hours. They get forced out, but they see it as a success. And Oakes has a great quote about this from the San Francisco Chronicle.
Well, it's a success, and that people are noticing that it's taking place, and they can't help but notice what it represents. And he said, if a one-day occupation by white men on Indian land years ago established squatters' rights, then the one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the island.
Reciprocity's a hell of a drug.
Touche.
Yeah. It did work, but I love your point there. It didn't work in terms of physical occupation, but it did work in terms of what I would call mental occupation and awareness. It actually raised awareness. And this is a lesson that a lot of those ersatz fundraisers from the very wealthy who are like, oh, we're throwing this opulent ball to raise awareness of people we've never met and don't really care about. That's a lesson you could take, philanthropist.
Yeah.
I walked down the street from that one, but it is irritating. The protesters do make another attempt to seize Alcatraz. This is the big one. Paul, if we could get some conspiratorial adventure music. Paul's seen The Rock. You know what we're talking about. Like the Escape from Alcatraz kind of stuff. Perfect. All right, it's November 20th, 1969. It's the wee hours, pre-dawn. An occupation force of 89 men, women, and children sail through San Francisco Bay under the cover of darkness. They land at Alcatraz. They claim the island for all the indigenous tribes of North America. They issue a manifesto addressed to the Great White Father and all his people. And they say, look, we're going to do what we said we're going to do. This is going to be a school. It's going to be a cultural center. We're going to make a museum as well. And they said, look, we know the rules. We'll do what you guys said. Alcatraz is ours by rights of discovery.
Hell yeah. Dude, no, come on. They sailed there and they discovered that thing.
Right. And
this is American as hell, y'all.
Right.
I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
By the way, is the Great White Father Nixon? Who is the Great White Father in this manifesto?
It's like the
title?
idea of white power.
Yeah, okay. Got it.
And they also said, this is my favorite part. This is part of why we're telling this story, because we need some levity here. The group said, Alcatraz, it's definitely ours, but if you want, we'll buy it from you. We'll give you $24 worth of glass beads and some red cloth.
Oh,
this is
snap.
peak trolling, right?
Dude, yeah, which is supposedly the same price that Indians received for the entire island of Manhattan, which we know America's gotten some real bang for that buck. So once again, touche, I say. The activists said they didn't mind that the island was underdeveloped. They were even cool with the lack of fresh water. Most of them had already, I mean, to our previous point, endured far worse conditions on the reservations that the United States so graciously bestowed upon them.
Let's really think about like the work it would take to make a working, all of the stuff that this group wanted to do on Alcatraz, just setting up the supply lines and everything. My God, I mean, if you're willing to do that, then as a U.S. government, you should be like, okay, that sounds great.
Yes, thank you for taking care of this problem.
It's a huge opportunity, but it's just going to be so much work.
What I mean by an opportunity is an opportunity to show collaboration and working together, and maybe it could have been seen as a good PR move because the onus of getting the work done is on them. So what do we have to lose? We give them the island, say go for it, and then if they do it, then that's an example of Native American ingenuity that has been bolstered by the magnanimous acts of Uncle Sam.
Haha, doo-doo, first off. Secondly, agreed. The issue we have to remember from the federal perspective at this time, this was close to capitulating to terrorism, right? It was seen as a threat to the status quo.
It just seems so short-sighted.
Well, who are we to judge good folks like Hoover and Nixon?
Well, we're Matt, Ben, and Noel, the conspiracy boys. That's who we are.
Well, how did Nixon respond?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the setup there, Matt. Yeah, the administration opted to bide their time. They said, look, we are not going to, this might be a bit of a lose-lose, Kobayashi Maru, but the lesser loss is to not interfere. The greater loss is violent intervention, a siege of Alcatraz.
Okay,
so they said, as long as these protesters remain peaceful, eventually they're going to run out of stuff. They're like, we all know about this island. Eventually, to the point we're making about supply chains, we're going to run out of support there. These folks will leave. This will also exit the news cycle. Yet celebrities joined in. This is around the time that we see this groundswell of like Jane Fonda, Marlon Brando support. The band Creedence Clearwater gave the protesters their own boat to help with supply lines. It was called the Clearwater.
Thank God Creedence is in the mix, y'all. You know, that's when you know things are taking a turn for the better.
Was unavailable.
He was unavailable
for several reasons.
And I'm sorry, I guess I when I was talking earlier about like it could have been a PR opportunity, I guess the U.S. did sort of act in the way that I was describing. They didn't like stage a siege of the protest. They didn't intervene with violence. They basically left them to their own devices for a time. But I guess that did not go on forever.
Yeah, 19 months, which is a very long time for an occupation. It's quite extraordinary, actually. And even as the protest was still underway in, July of 1970, then President Nixon gave a speech saying his version of like, I get it. He said the time has come for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. Now, a lot of activists would argue that was the original era of Native American communities.
Right.
But the U.S. government did later return millions of acres of ancestral land to indigenous communities. They passed a bunch of legislative proposals, let me be careful how I say this, that seemed to support tribal autonomy, which led to some of the stuff we're talking about now, or we mentioned earlier, the idea of tribal police, the idea of a government within a government on a reservation.
So isn't he essentially saying like, we would like it to go back to you guys governing and taking care of yourselves without us having to help you?
Similar.
It seems like that's the vibe. Like, here, we'll give you back some of this stuff that we took, but we are now basically more or less washing our hands of you.
There were light. Well, there were. Let me be clear. There were concrete pieces of legislation here that did provide means of support and transition to.
Maybe I'm being too hard on it. I mean, it's
things.
hard not to be, especially given the first half of the podcast and all of the gnarly stuff we did and how long it took to act. So I apologize if I'm going a little too hard on old Uncle Sammy boy.
I don't think an apology is necessary.
Just wait.
Yeah, just you wait. So the Indian rights organizations continued, however, because a promise from the American government, as you might assume, is treated a little bit skeptically by these communities. Why is that? Well, they're you're a Google search away, folks. So Indian rights organizations also were galvanized by the imperfect yet clear success of the Alcatraz occupation. We saw later protest at Plymouth Rock, Mount Rushmore, at the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., dozens and dozens of other sites. Should we talk a little bit about that BIA occupation?
Yes, I think we should, because this happened in the heart of Washington, D.C., which, as we know, the FBI don't take kindly to people who mess around in Washington, D.C., in their neck of the woods. And this act, what occurred here is, in my opinion, at least, guys, what galvanized a lot of the FBI movement to really crack down on the American Indian movement and all of these movements that are occurring at this time. So yeah, let's dive in. What exactly did they do physically there at the Bureau of Indian Affairs?
So this is a culmination of some earlier protests, some traveling protests, and when AIM arrives in DC inside the Beltway, they take over the U.S. Department of the Interior building. This is the reason they do it is because this is what houses the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they occupy it from November 3rd to November 9th, 1972. In a peaceful way, okay? So they're not busting heads. They're not zip tying folks and, throwing around nooses and stuff like that. But
according to internal FBI memos, they are violent and they stole a bunch of documents and broke a bunch of stuff inside the building. Oh my God,
my diary.
Well, just from the FBI's perspective, they're like,
Right.
This is super violent and dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they said, look, we'll leave this building after the White House promises to address most of their concerns. This is around the time they released something called the 20 Points, which primarily addresses violations of other treaties or previous treaties. And interagency task force is going to be created. The Nixon administration works with them. They negotiate with them and they say, okay, we'll have some folks from the Nixon administration, some representatives from the White House involved with, name the Indian activist organizations you want. We will have them with us at the table. Everybody will have a seat at the table. We're also going to have more legislation offering more autonomy to tribes. But that's not the end of the story, because folks, if you've listened this long, you know what kind of show we are.
Yeah. So we said that occupation ended on November 9th, 1972. On November 11th, 1972, there was a memorandum sent within the FBI that identified the American Indian movement as a dangerous threat, and they were now going to treat them as they had been treating the Black Power movement and the other civil rights movements. Yeah. Exactly. And you can read these documents online. You can find them. There's a great section where I'm just going to read this really quickly, guys. This is an internal memo that was sent by W. Mark Felt, the acting associate director of the FBI, to the special agent in charge in Albany, New York. And he said, each special agent in charge should have a survey conducted and following data should be furnished to headquarters. Approximate number of Indians residing within the division, number of reservations including the number of Indians residing therein, identity of tribes within the division, and identity of any known extremist organizations or extremist individuals active within the Indian community, including the bureau file number, if any.
So this is just short of placing them on a domestic terrorist watch list,
This
right?
is essentially the same thing.
It is the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that's just a couple days after that occupation ended. And I think it's because it was at the heart of DC.
Mm-hmm. And you could smell it on the wind. Things were turning violent. We're going to take a pause for a word from our sponsors, and then we'll get further into this.
And we're back. Guys, really quickly, I'm sorry, I don't want to get political here, but what would happen on January 6th, with these folks that literally invaded, government buildings and absolutely smashed stuff up and injured, personnel? It feels like the reaction to this Native American protest in D.C. is treated much more harshly than those good white folks that smashed up, government property.
Well, I don't know. That's a weird thing because, you read in the news, there are people getting jail sentences for their actions they took on that day.
True,
just
but
continuously.
There's a divide, but I guess it's more a rhetorical divide. So maybe I'm overthinking it a little bit, but I don't know. It's just it's weird.
I would just point to the actions specifically that the FBI took back then in 1972. One of the primary ways that they wanted to get that information that we referenced before the break in that memo was to create informants within the movements. Like, that was their primary goal. Get people who will snitch within the organization. It's the same thing they did with the civil rights movement. Think about, what was his name? William O'Neill, who was working like right next to Fred Hampton and, at least arguably caused Fred Hampton's death, and then took his own life. And there are all kinds of infiltrations of groups like this. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go down this rabbit hole, y'all, but like, I don't even know how I got here. Oh, Lord.
I dug the hole, Matt. I dug the hole with the insurrectionist question.
First, I would also check out our earlier episode, Is the FBI Manufacturing Terrorists? That is a darkly hilarious story. Second, can you guys catch me up? January what? What happened?
well, yeah. I don't know if you guys saw that. There's a viral song that came out about how nobody gives an F about January 6th. It's very funny. You should find it. I don't know what it's called, who the artist is. Very funny, but and poignant, actually. But I was kind of going all of that way to get to our exploration of the FBI and other groups' infiltration of like white supremacist, white nationalist movements and other movements like that, like far-right extremists, just like far-left extremists. There was a great piece in Rolling Stone recently about the work of Agent Scott B., and I'm doing that with quotation marks, who was an actual FBI agent, not an informant, who went undercover for decades in a group, in various groups like that, neo-Nazi groups, white nationalist groups. I would say that kind of infiltration into groups that were probably present on January 6th is one of the reasons why there's so much information and so many people are going to jail.
It's also one of the few, I'll say it, I should be careful about this, but it's also one of the few viable human operations that you can do now. And the folks who are doing those sorts of operations, just to be clear, they are risking their lives. Actually, you could say they're losing their lives in some sense either way. And, we have to remember that regardless of what you may think personally about a given organization that is being infiltrated in this way, the aim of those agents, or I should say the goal of those agents, is a noble cause. They're hoping to save lives. And they're usually, when they move past monitoring to intervention, it's typically in an effort to curtail a mass casualty event, just to be absolutely clear.
Sometimes.
And
but
then
I mean,
sometimes they lose the way. Mission creep is real, right?
Think about the infiltration of the SCLC and the, there are a lot of alleged
I'm talking about the
informants.
modern day, to be clear. I'm not talking
heard.
about the crazy racist COINTELPRO stuff.
I got you. No, I'm totally with you. I think about the stuff, the alleged informants that were all around Martin Luther King Jr., right, towards the end of his life. Well, there are some that are alleged that are like known figures that are not outed as an informant right now, at least in the zeitgeist.
Just got some sweet pundit and publishing deals.
Well, yeah. And we also think about, we mentioned William O'Neill, who, I'm sorry to derail us again, guys, but if you think about the way that an informant can be created, if you think about William O'Neill, who was 18 years old and got caught driving a stolen vehicle across state lines by an FBI agent, and they immediately swooped in, like when he's 18 years old, and they said, hey, this can all go away. We'll even give you a little stipend every month if you just tell us what's going on within your organization. And that's kind of how it can happen. And it's just that, for me, that freaks me out. And when I'm thinking about the American Indian movement and, as we're moving through time here, just the potential for that kind of intervention, specifically by the FBI or by like Homeland Security or some other group like that.
You want to leverage a problem because ultimately you want to control an asset. It's okay to pay somebody, but you can't really trust somebody if you're just paying them. And it's tough to trust somebody just for ideology. So one thing the US and Russia have historically been very successful at domestically and abroad is stuff like honey traps, stuff to where you get somebody to say yes to something, and then you normalize that and you expand that Overton window of action, right? Such that the asset, the mole, the informant, whomever, must always play ball, because now the consequences for not playing ball are far worse, right? That's what you want to do. You want to get your hooks in them. And it happens around the world because it's a tremendously effective strategy. So I think those are really good points. Earlier, we were talking about how things turned violent in the case of the American Indian movement. To Uncle Sam, post DC, as we pointed out, even before DC, to be honest with you, AIM and similar Native American activist organizations have moved from inconvenience to threat. Alcatraz was probably one of the fulcrum points for that because it lasted for more than a year. The U.S. suppression of AIM throughout these multiple protests, some of which were violent, like in the Dakotas, they sowed the seeds for this 71-day siege in February of 1973. The AIM leader at the time, Russell Means, and his organization took over a small Native American community of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and they were protesting enormous local tensions, right? Further discrimination against the Native population. FBI agents are immediately dispatched to remove the occupiers. They cordon off the area. They refuse to allow the press inside. There's a standoff, a siege, really, that goes on for 71 days. People are firing. There is live fire. All told, 2 Native American activists are killed, 14 are wounded, 2 G-men, 2 FBI agents are killed, 2 were wounded. One guy disappeared, and people still aren't sure what happened to him. His name's Ray Robinson, African-American civil rights activist, is an ally for this cause. He's believed to have been murdered, but I think even now as we record in 2024, the question is still open. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So all told, 1,200 people are arrested at the conclusion of this siege, including the Dennis Banks, whom we mentioned earlier, co-founder of AIM. The leaders get tried in a court in Minnesota. The trial lasts 8 months, and they get acquitted of everything, which is pretty unusual. And to be quite honest, I'm sure there were many members of the U.S. public who were saying, hey, no, lock them up or whatever.
It's intense, especially considering 4 people died.
Yeah, and there's so much more to the story. These events don't just echo the earlier events of the civil rights movement. They also foreshadow government approaches to other standoffs. The Waco disaster would be an example.
Yeah, and I think about Ruby Ridge too. I think those are the 2 things that, at least in America, maybe we think about from stuff we've learned in school. But it is astonishing to imagine that this went on for over 70 days when something like Ruby Ridge went on for only 10 days. And I have never heard of this before.
And there is so much more for us to get to. In fact, we earlier in the course of our mutual research, we made the decision to follow up with an episode entirely about Leonard Peltier, who, as of July 2nd, 2024, was again denied parole. There's so much to this story. It's going to be another episode in the future.
Do you want to just give a mini background on who that person is so people can look into it if they want to and or wait for our episode? Yeah.
So Leonard Peltier is alive, a member of the American Indian movement. He is officially convicted of 2 counts of homicide, first-degree murder of 2 federal agents, Ronald Arthur Williams and Jack Ross Kohler, both special agents for the FBI. His trial was enormously controversial. A ton of the witness testimony is wonky. Allegations of conspiracy are, as our pal Frank would say, wide rife.
Yes.
Right. We also know that many of the people who were involved in his initial trial, who were involved in his conviction, have later reneged on their conclusions and believe that this was a stitch up by the feds.
Dude, there's so many connections here to the American Indian movement and the civil rights movement. It reminds me of our interview with Mosi Secret, his show Radical, where we talked about Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Min, who was formerly known as H. Rap Brown, a Black Power activist who is accused of killing a police officer, right? And has been in jail and has been denied parole and all that stuff so many times. It's really interesting how close that connection is.
And one important point for us to bring home, folks, fellow conspiracy realists, it's something you may deal with on this show. It's something we deal with constantly. You don't have to personally agree with someone's ideology or their aims or, whatever their weird vision board is to clock when there is a conspiracy afoot. You know what I mean? The law should apply equally to all people.
Which should. Well, and the allegations and thoughts of a potential conspiracy are not aided when the FBI is actively conspiring to put informants in your group. Yeah. So, and they were doing the same thing with various Islamic communities around the world, especially if you think about the early 2000s. I mean, it really bothers me. The other thing we should note, by the way, is that right after a lot of this stuff that we were talking about in 1976, we were talking about the infiltration of the American Indian movement by the FBI. In 1976, the Church Committee and the Pike Committee both came back with their findings, and they basically outlawed most of those activities. The autonomous spying on Americans by the FBI, right? Like just, we do it on our own and no oversight, nobody knows. And then that's around the time when FISA courts come around and all that stuff.
Which were great for the rubber stamp industry.
Oh, well, yeah. It's also great when you create an entirely new department like the Department of Homeland Security.
Which is still a dumb name.
Because now they can just spy on people.
Yeah. Shout out to Five Eyes. Here's what we can tell you. If you want to learn more about Leonard Peltier in advance of our episode entirely about this story, check out his memoir from 1999, Prison Writings, My Life is My Sundance. The American Indian movement continues today. They've got a website. They've got a number of social media accounts. They ally with a lot of other protest and activist organizations. You can learn more about them there. The fight for, regardless of how you feel about the events of the past or protests, past and current, the fight for rights of Native Americans is inherently, it's the fight that every American should agree with. It continues here in the United States as well as in Canada, and it will continue because the consequences of the past themselves continue in the present day. I think we can all agree, even in our divisive times, pretty much every American knows the government harbors a lot of stuff they don't want you to know. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. We try to be easy to find online.
That's right. You can find us all over the internet at your handle of choice, starting with Conspiracy Stuff, where we exist on Facebook, where you can find our Facebook group. Here's where it gets crazy. On X, FKA Twitter, and on YouTube, where we have video content coming at you. On Instagram and TikTok, however, you can find it to the handle Conspiracy Stuff Show. But wait, there's more.
Yes. Do you want to call us? Call 1-833-STDWYTK. That's our voicemail system. When you call in, you've got 3 minutes to say what you want. Do please include a nickname for yourself and a little part of the message that says we can use your name and message on one of our listener mail episodes. And that's really it. Those are the only rules. The rest is yours to decide. Unless you've got more to send us, or more than can fit in a 3-minute voicemail message, why not instead send us a good old-fashioned email? We are
the entities that read every piece of correspondence we receive. Be well aware, but not frightened. The void may respond. Of particular interest is a great conversation we've been having about the idea of psychics in the Cold War, the countermeasures that may or may not be applied. It's a grand thought experiment. We can't wait for you to be part of it. Stay tuned for that episode as well. Conspiracy at iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.